So think about it like this. You break an arm, right? You go to the hospital. The x-ray shows a clean, jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Right, it's totally binary. It's either broken or it's not broken.
Exactly. But when you step into the world of neurodevelopment and childhood trauma, that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, it's the ultimate diagnostic muddy water. I mean, you can't just take an x-ray of a child's behavior to see the underlying fracture.
Right. So today for our deep dive, we are throwing out the x-ray. We're looking at what happens when a student's nervous system is quite literally under siege.
Because for so long, we've relied on behavioral discipline simply because it's visible. You can see a kid acting out. But a dysregulated nervous system is completely invisible to the naked eye.
Yeah, and we're finally seeing schools start to treat the hardware, not just like constantly punishing the software. We're pulling from some incredible clinical research on childhood trauma today, and we're also looking at a really innovative K-12 program in Georgia called MentalSpace School to see how this actually plays out on the ground.
It's a huge shift in how we approach education and mental health.
It really is. And, I think we all know the baseline of ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, if you follow psychology or education at all, you're probably familiar with the standard metrics.
Right, the original 10 categories from the ACE study. So for you listening, that includes physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Then there's physical and emotional neglect, and household dysfunction, which covers parental separation, mental illness, substance use, domestic violence, and incarceration.
Which is a heavy list. But what's fascinating here is that subsequent research didn't just stop at the front door of the house.
Right, it goes way beyond the household now.
Exactly. The clinical framework has broadened significantly. Because if we are talking about physiological impact, the body's threat response system doesn't differentiate between the threat of domestic violence inside the home and the threat of community violence outside of it.
That makes total sense. Fear is fear to the brain.
Right. So the research now explicitly includes systemic stressors. We're talking about poverty, community violence, racism, and chronic discrimination. And why this matters is because it shifts the entire lens from, what are this individual child's personal failings to what environmental toxins has this child been chronically exposed to.
That reframing is massive. It treats trauma as an exposure, like lead paint, rather than some kind of character flaw.
Yeah, it completely removes the blame from the child.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy so you can really visualize what this exposure does to a kid's brain. Think of a child's brain experiencing these chronic environmental stressors, like a computer running a massive hidden virus scan in the background.
Oh, I love that analogy. It's so accurate.
Right. Because if you've ever had a laptop doing that, it just drains the battery incredibly fast. The fan is whirring. The whole thing is overheating.
And it makes every other program you actually want to use run incredibly slowly. Or they just crash altogether.
Exactly. Like you're trying to open Word or the internet, or in the student's case, math and reading, and it just freezes.
The computer analogy is spot on because we are quite literally talking about processing power. I mean, the brain has a finite amount of metabolic energy.
Right.
And when a child is exposed to chronic adversity, their amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, it becomes hyperactive.
It's constantly pulling power away from everything else.
Exactly. It pulls power from the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for executive function, impulse control, and complex learning. The operating system is just entirely bogged down by the demands of survival.
Wow. So if trauma is that hidden background program, how does it actually physically show up in a classroom setting? Because I was reading through the clinical signs of trauma in the sources, and what really struck me is how easily these just mimic bad behavior.
Oh, they mimic it perfectly. It's misdiagnosed constantly.
So let's trace a scenario. Let's look at the first clinical sign, which is hypervigilance. Say you have a student sitting at a desk, and that hidden background program is beating up all their bandwidth, and a heavy textbook drops off a desk in the back of the room.
A classic classroom distraction.
Right. Now, a neurotypical kid might startle, look back, and then just return to their worksheet. But for a kid with a maxed out nervous system, you see hypervigilance. They don't just startle.
No, their entire system goes on high alert.
Exactly. They are locked onto the back of the room, their heart rate spikes, and they physically can't look away from the door. But here's my pushback, or at least my observation on this. If I'm a teacher with 30 kids in a room, and I see a kid constantly scanning the room like that, not looking at me, my immediate instinct is to label them inattentive or even defiant.
And that misinterpretation happens thousands of times a day in schools all over the country. The teacher sees a refusal to engage with the lesson.
Which is incredibly frustrating for the teacher, obviously.
Totally. But from a neurological standpoint, the student isn't ignoring the teacher to be difficult. Their nervous system is actively prioritizing survival over the lesson plan. I mean, you can't focus on fractions if your brain's alarm system is screaming that a tiger is in the room.
Right. The hypervigilance is the virus scan taking over the monitor.
Yeah.
You literally can't see the worksheet anymore.
Exactly. Which leads us right into the second clinical sign, which is emotional dysregulation.
All right, so let's continue that same scenario. Maybe the teacher asks that hypervigilant student to, turn around and get back to work. And the student just absolutely explodes.
Because the system crashes.
Yeah, they yell, they knock their chair over. They're at a level 10 over what seems like a incredibly minor redirection.
Right. But you have to remember, when that background virus scan is already using 99% of your RAM, opening one extra PDF, or in this case, receiving one mild teacher redirection, causes a total system failure.
So tiny triggers produce these massive reactions.
Exactly. The child isn't overreacting to the request to turn around. Their baseline stress level was already at a 9. That single redirection was just the final variable that completely overwhelmed their capacity to self-regulate.
Wow. And then there's the third sign, which is actually the complete opposite of an explosion. It's avoidance.
Yes, the
Well,
shutdown response.
Right. The student just withdraws. They might put their head on the desk, refuse to speak, or eventually they just start skipping that class entirely. And what's wild is that the sources note that very often the student doesn't even have the vocabulary to explain why. They just feel this intense need to escape.
Avoidance is basically the nervous system's way of force quitting the application. If fight or flight aren't working, the brain goes into a freeze or fawn response. It just disconnects.
It's just trying to protect itself.
Exactly. And what these three signs, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and avoidance, what they prove is that trauma isn't just a psychological memory neatly filed away in the past. It's a physiological state. It's happening right now in their body.
Yeah, I love how one of the sources phrased it. The kid isn't giving the school a hard time, the kid is having a hard time.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
But honestly, hearing how profoundly the nervous system is rewired, it makes it sound terrifyingly permanent. Like, if a child's hardware is this compromised by systemic stressors and ACEs, are they just doomed to these negative outcomes?
That's the historical fear, right? But neurobiology provides a resounding no.
Okay, good. Because we need some hope here.
We do, and the hope is brain plasticity. The same neuroplasticity that allows a child's brain to adapt to a dangerous environment by becoming hypervigilant also allows it to adapt to a safe environment and heal.
So ACEs are not destiny. Brains are plastic, and trauma is treatable. The kid in front of you can still have a really strong life. The sources are incredibly emphatic about this.
Absolutely, but there is a specific magic formula, if you will, to actually rewiring that hardware based on decades of resilience research.
Right, and it requires a very specific combination of two elements. The first is a consistent, caring relationship with at least one stable adult.
Which is foundational. The stable adult provides the environmental safety signal the brain needs to even begin turning off that background virus scan.
Okay, but I have a pointed question for you and for everyone listening to consider. Because we put so much pressure on educators, is just being a really great, caring teacher enough to fix this? Like, if a teacher loves their students fiercely, is that enough?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer is no. While a stable adult is the crucial anchor, the second half of that equation is evidence-based trauma-responsive care. And that is non-negotiable for true mitigation.
So love is essential, but it doesn't replace targeted therapy.
Exactly. Love does not rewrite corrupted software. If a child has a broken arm, a teacher's compassion is essential for comforting the child, but it doesn't set the bone. The clinical care is the bone setting.
I love that. Okay, so let's talk about setting the bone. Because the sources mention an alphabet soup of clinical care.
Yeah.
We need to look at specific evidence-based treatments for young minds. It's not just general talk therapy.
No, general counseling is great for many things, but it's not trauma therapy.
Right, so let's break down the actual treatments that are effective, starting with TF-CBT, which stands for Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. This one has the absolute strongest evidence base for children and adolescents. How does this actually work for a kid?
Well, TF-CBT is considered the gold standard because it's highly structured. It doesn't just ask a child, how does that make you feel?
Right, which probably wouldn't get you very far with a dysregulated kid anyway.
Exactly. Instead, it actively works to identify cognitive distortions. That's the faulty code the brain wrote during the traumatic event.
Give me an example of that.
So a child who experienced abuse might have internalized the underlying belief, I am inherently bad, and that is why bad things happen to me. TF-CBT provides specific psychoeducation and gradual exposure techniques to help the child dismantle that false narrative.
So it's actively helping them rewrite the code.
Exactly. It targets the specific mechanism of the trauma to change that core belief.
That makes total sense. Okay, the next one is EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Now, I feel like we hear about this all the time for adults like combat veterans, but it's specifically adapted for younger clients too. How does moving your eyes actually process trauma?
EMDR is fascinating because it directly targets the brain's information processing system. When a trauma occurs, the memory often gets improperly stored in the brain's emotional center, the amygdala.
Along with all the original panic and physical sensations.
Right, it's stuck in the active RAM, going back to our computer analogy. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation. For a child, this could be following a therapist's finger back and forth with their eyes, or using tapping or holding these little vibrating buzzers in each hand.
Wait, really? Well, they're thinking about the traumatic event.
Yes, exactly. They hold a piece of the traumatic memory in their mind while simultaneously experiencing this left-right brain stimulation.
That sounds intense. Why does that work?
The prevailing theory is that this mimics the biological mechanism of REM sleep, which is how our brains naturally process daily events. The bilateral stimulation essentially unfreezes the information processing system.
Oh, wow. So it detaches the physical panic from the factual memory?
Precisely. It defragments the hard drive and moves the memory from the active RAM into long-term storage where it belongs. The memory doesn't disappear, obviously, but it stops triggering the physical alarm system.
That is incredible. And then for the absolute youngest children, the sources highlight CPP, which is child-parent psychotherapy.
Yeah, CPP is vital because it introduces the concept of treating the dyad, the parent and the child together.
Right, because you can't exactly put a 4-year-old in a leather chair and ask them to process their systemic stressors.
No, of course not. For a toddler or a preschooler, the parent fundamentally is their environment. Children that young rely entirely on co-regulation. Their nervous system literally mirrors the nervous system of their primary caregiver.
So if the parent is dysregulated because of poverty or trauma, the kid is going to mirror that.
Exactly. CPP works with the parent and child simultaneously to repair their attachment and build the parent's capacity to provide a regulating, safe presence. Rather than just isolating the child in a therapist's office, you are treating the environment itself.
Which highlights a huge logistical nightmare, honestly.
Yeah.
Because all three of these modalities, TF-CBT, EMDR, and CPP, they all require highly specialized, licensed clinicians.
Absolutely. There aren't things you can just read a book on and start doing.
Right. And a school counselor, as amazing and essential as they are, is generally not licensed to perform EMDR on a dysregulated fourth grader. So how does the school system actually connect struggling kids with licensed clinicians trained in these specific modalities?
That is the massive bottleneck in the system.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting in the sources. There's this massive distinction they make. Trauma-informed schools is often just a slogan in many districts. But trauma-responsive care is an actual clinical practice.
It's a canyon of difference. Being trauma-informed usually just means the staff took like a half-day professional development seminar. They know the virus exists, but they have no antivirus software to actually install.
Exactly. And traditionally, if a teacher notices a severe issue, the school just refers the family to an outside clinic. And we all know how that goes.
Right. The parents have to navigate a referral system, sit on a wait list for 6 months, figure out how to take time off work.
In the middle of a Tuesday, right? Arrange transportation, figure out how to pay a massive out-of-pocket deductible. It's friction at every single step, so the care just doesn't happen.
And the kid stays dysregulated, and the classroom stays disrupted. Which brings us directly to MentalSpace School.
Yes. MentalSpace provides this missing clinical piece for K-12 schools in Georgia. And they aren't just running another awareness seminar. They provide same-day teletherapy and dedicated therapist teams per school. They are specifically bridging the gap between a teacher noticing hypervigilance and a licensed, culturally competent clinician delivering TF-CBT.
It's revolutionary because it removes the geographic and temporal friction. The child just goes to a designated safe room in their own school building, opens a laptop, and connects with a clinician.
And it gets better because MentalSpace offers a massive, comprehensive safety net. We aren't just talking about individual therapy. They do crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, family counseling, and even staff wellness.
Which is so important because, as we discussed with the CPP dyad model, if the adults in the building are dysregulated, the students will mirror that.
Totally. And the logistics of their accessibility are just mind-blowing. This isn't just a boutique service for wealthy districts. Kids on Medicaid pay literally $0.
$0 for trauma-responsive clinical care during the school day.
Yep, $0.
Yeah.
And they also accept a massive list of commercial plans. We're talking Blue Cross, Blue Shield,
Right.
Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, AmeriGroup. They have completely removed the financial friction.
And from an administrative side, which is vital for schools, it's fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant. Plus, it specifically supports schools in hitting the upcoming July 2026 deadline for HB 268 compliance in Georgia.
Which is huge for district administrators listening right now. But let's talk about the actual outcomes. Because the hard data proves this model works. MentalSpace tracks an 89% improved attendance rate and a 92% reduction in anxiety among students.
Those numbers are staggering,
Okay.
but they make perfect sense when you return to the computer analogy. When you clear the hidden virus scan, the computer runs the way it was designed to.
Right, the prefrontal cortex comes back online. The child can finally focus on learning.
Exactly.
So for anyone listening in the education space, especially in Georgia, you could look into the logistics of their model at mentalspaceschool.com or email them at mentalspaceschool@cheegetherapy.com. It's truly a game changer.
It really is.
So just to recap our journey today, we started by understanding the hidden weight of ACEs. We threw out the behavioral X-ray and learned how to recognize the actual physiological signs of trauma in the classroom, the hypervigilance, the emotional dysregulation, the avoidance.
Right, and we established the absolute necessity of combining a caring adult with targeted clinical therapies like TF-CBT and EMDR.
Exactly. And finally, we saw how organizations like MentalSpace are turning trauma-informed slogans into trauma-responsive realities.
You know, this raises an important question. If the data explicitly shows that providing consistent clinical mental health care within the school environment drastically improves attendance by 89% and reduces anxiety by 92%,
Yeah.
should we stop viewing therapy as just an extracurricular add-on to education and instead recognize it as the fundamental prerequisite for learning itself?
Oh, wow. That is a massive paradigm shift. If the hardware is broken, the software won't run. We have to stop treating the symptoms of broken system and actually start repairing the hardware. Well, that is a perfect thought to leave you with today. Keep digging into the forces that shape our minds and our schools. We'll catch you next time.